Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I first of all want to begin by thanking all of you for taking the time to be here for this presentation today. Last year, the University of St. Thomas entered into a partnership with the Interfaith Youth Corps to improve our interfaith engagement here on campus. And that included a survey that went out to all students. Thank you for those of you who participated, to staff and faculty. It will include asset mapping, strategy development, and strategy implementation. To help us further this discussion, we are delighted that Dr. Eboo Patel, who is the president and founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, is here with us today. Eboo's core belief is that religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. He's inspired to build this bridge by his faith as a Muslim, his Indian heritage, and his American citizenship. He has spoken about this vision at places like the TED Conference, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, as well as many college and university campuses across this country. He's written 2 books about interfaith cooperation, Acts of Faith and Sacred Ground. Some people ask if Eboo ever stops talking about interfaith, and if it's any indication, his 5-year-old son can define interfaith cooperation. So, good job as a parent there as well. Eboo is a member of President Barack Obama's inaugural Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He attended the University of Illinois at Urbana for his undergraduate studies and earned a degree in sociology. He has a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Eboo is a seeker of truth, a man of faith, and a friend. Eboo, welcome to St. Thomas.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Father Larry. Father Larry and I first met as members of President Obama's inaugural Faith Council, and it was there that I first of all got to thank him for the ways that my Muslim family from India has gained from the Catholic tradition in the United States and elsewhere. My entire family has in some way or another been educated in Catholic institutions. In so many ways, my first faith hero was Dorothy Day, and Father Larry ran Catholic Charities before coming to the University of St. Thomas. And I asked him earlier this morning, how big was that budget? Thinking our 45 staff at IFYC is pretty impressive. How did Father Larry do? He said, $4.6 billion. I just think about, you probably couldn't count on 2 hands the number of Catholic social service agencies that are only for Catholics. Right? In other words, this massive endeavor in civil society that helps people who have addiction challenges, or foster care issues, or poverty issues, this massive set of institutions that was inspired by the Catholic tradition, that has been stood up by Catholic philanthropic dollars, that is run by faithful Catholics, that serves the country. I just find an exemplary example of what it means to be faithful, which is to say to give of one's own identity in a way that serves the common good. I saw that on a purple bus this morning, by the way. I like the fact that St. Thomas comes both from the Catholic tradition and from Prince, the purple, right? I'm assuming that's where you got it from. In any case, I'm enormously proud to be here. The question that I want to address today is, in what ways can a Catholic institution be a laboratory and a launching pad for interfaith cooperation, for interfaith leadership, for interfaith excellence, really? And I actually want to get into that by way of biography of one of the people that I like and admire most in the world, a Catholic theologian named Paul Knitter. Anybody here familiar with Paul Knitter? Very significant Catholic theologian, especially of religious diversity. He's written all kinds of things, including Many Faiths, One Earth, Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian, a variety of books on the topic. But his story, I think, is very instructive. particularly about the role of Catholic universities. So Paul Knitter decided he wanted to be a priest when he was 12 or 13 years old. And back in those days in the south side of Chicago, you could actually go to a high school that funneled you into a seminary for the priesthood. So at 13 or 14, he enters into a Catholic high school for young priests, and he goes on to college and seminary within this tradition, within this charism, the SVD order. And as he deepens his knowledge and love of the Catholic Church, and as he prepares to be a Catholic missionary in Buddhist Japan, he starts to notice some of the interesting ways that his fellow priests are talking about India and China and the places where they had gone on their mission trips. He starts to detect in their tone a hint of admiration for the Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim populations in those countries. And there was no question that they saw the fullness of the feast in Catholicism. But when they brought a dance group from India that had dedicated their dance to Jesus and to adoration of the saints, the priest mentioned that the origins of this dance was in Hinduism. And so Paul is listening to his brother priests, many of them older than him and much more experienced, talk about their love of Catholicism and their admiration for other traditions. And as he's reading about the culture of Japan, the country where he's going to go and be a missionary, he starts to develop a depth of appreciation for Zen Buddhism. And he doesn't quite know what to do with this, right? It's the late 1950s and early 1960s. He knows both of these things are true. Number one, he loves and believes in the fullness of truth in the Catholic Church. And two, the Satori experience described in Japanese Zen Buddhism, the sense of stillness, meditativeness, contemplativeness, the love of the holy, he finds something deeply admirable in that. Doesn't quite have the language for it yet, but he can't shake the feeling. He decides in the early 1960s to go pursue his continued theological studies in Rome, at the Vatican, at the Gregorian University there. And he winds up there at the same time as a great Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner, winds up there. And it turns out that Professor Rahner's concerns were much the same as his. This question of what of the depth in other religious traditions? What of their glimpse of the quote-unquote truth? What of their holding of the holy within the bounds of their understanding of God? What do we make of this? So Paul is sitting in these classes thinking to himself, wow, one of the great theologians of our time has this same set of concerns that I do. And he's starting to find language for, again, his love and fidelity to the church and his admiration for other traditions. And those of you who know Catholic history will know that something was moving in Rome in the early to mid-1960s, this little thing called Vatican II, and the emergence of a document called Nostra Aetate in our time. And because Paul had his proximity to the language of Latin was much closer than the proximity of the cardinals who were coming to this conclave at Vatican II. And because the way that the church does business, as you all know, is in Latin, what would happen is these cardinals who were coming to the Vatican II conference, whose Latin was, let us say, a little bit rusty, would approach Paul with the sub secreto documents. Am I saying that correctly? The secret documents of the church as they were in draft form, and ask Paul to translate from Latin into Italian or Latin into Portuguese or Latin into English, whatever language was their indigenous language. And Paul, in his 20s, in the early 1960s, finds himself reading rough, early, secret drafts of what becomes Nostra Aetate. And he thinks to himself, my goodness, the set of concerns in my heart, which again is about fidelity to the full truth that I see in my church and tradition, and a recognition of the glimpses of truth that exist in other traditions, an admiration of their processes and their being. Not only does Karl Rahner have this set of concerns, but the church as a body, as a holy body, has these concerns. And I think to myself, like, who has this experience, right, of not only living at a time when your concerns become history's concerns and the church's concerns, but actually reading these documents and I'm thinking he's like translating in Italian or Portuguese or English out loud, and he's tripping over the sentence because he can't believe what he's reading. He can't believe that the church is giving language, voice to what's been in his heart. Paul is on the vanguard of a massive shift in the way the Catholic Church understands other religions. I want to talk about this in three forms and talk about how I think these three forms belong centrally at a Catholic university. One, this notion of appreciative knowledge of other traditions. Just because one loves one's own tradition, is loyal to it, sees the fullness of truth in it, I think does not mean, as Paul finds out, that one doesn't recognize the beauty of the idea of mercy, Rahmah, in Islam, or the beauty of the notion of repairing the world in Judaism, or the understanding of the path of action, karma yoga, in Hinduism. Paul, the church, the world at this time are recognizing the importance of an appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions. What's an appreciative knowledge? It's basically knowing something about a different tradition or community or way of thinking that is not commonly displayed on the evening news. It's knowing that the most common prayer in Islam is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the all-merciful, the ever-merciful. It's knowing about the contribution of great Jewish figures in America and around the world, from Rabbi Hillel in the first century to Rabbi Heschel in the 20th century in the United States. It's recognizing that Gandhi was Gandhi because he was Hindu, because he derived from the Bhagavad Gita the same strength and courage and guidance that Martin Luther King Jr. derived from the Bible. It's knowing something that you love, you appreciate, you admire in a tradition with whose doctrine you might have some disagreements. Paul is developing this appreciative knowledge of other traditions. He is watching in Nostra Aetate that appreciative knowledge being written down in a church document. Two, a theology of interfaith cooperation, a recognition that partnering with people from other religious traditions is not just a civic endeavor. It's not just a business endeavor because your shops happen to be next to one another in Lake Street in Minneapolis. It's a holy endeavor. It's a churchly endeavor. It's what Jesus meant when he told the story of the Good Samaritan. What is that story? The lawyer asks Jesus, how do we attain eternal life? My wife is an attorney. I can imagine that question being asked in a just so voice. And Jesus says, you know the answer to that question. Love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor. And the lawyer, as I said, I can imagine how this is asked, asks the next cross-examination question. Well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story of a man left for dead by the side of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and two people pass him by, a priest and a Levite. Who stops? A man, a Samaritan, who tends the wounds of this man left in this ditch, puts oil and wine on those wounds, places him on the back of his donkey, takes him to the nearest inn, stays with him through the night, making sure that he lives, gives the innkeeper 2 days' wages and says, make sure that this man is nurtured back to health, and if you need more money, I will return and give you the additional money. Who was this man? What does it mean to be a Samaritan in Jesus' time? So in a different Bible story, the story of the woman at the well, Jesus engages in an argument with the Samaritan woman. You pray at a different temple. You pray to a God you do not know. Jesus is marking a theological, a doctrinal dispute with the Samaritans Who were the Samaritans? They were people with a different belief system, people who prayed to a different God, people who prayed at a different temple, people whom Jesus was not shy about saying, your path doctrinally is the wrong path. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, how does Jesus end that story? Go and do likewise. Who passed the man in the ditch by? Two leaders of his own religious community, priest and a Levite. Who stops to help? Somebody with a different doctrine, somebody who prays at a different temple, somebody who prays to a false God. What does Jesus tell his followers? Go and act more like the Samaritan in an instance like this. What is the question he is answering? How do we attain eternal life? A theology of interfaith cooperation. Sometimes, in situations of ethics, you might be called to follow not the people who share your doctrine or belief system, but the people who exhibit superior ethics, even if you disagree with their doctrine and belief system. A theology of interfaith cooperation. We partner with, we are friends with people with whose doctrine we disagree with because it is holy. Because in some instances, on some mountains, it is a path, as Jesus himself says, to eternal salvation. Every religious tradition has a sense of a theology of interfaith cooperation. It is in Islam, it is Quranic. We made you nations and tribes that you may come to know one another, but it is also in the stories of the tradition. Who was the first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad after his earth-shattering experience on Mount Hira in the year 610, when he was gripped by the angel Gabriel, when the words whisper were whispered in his, when the words Iqra, recite, were whispered in his mouth, in his ear, and he said, I am not a reciter. And the first words of the Quran, recite in the name of your Lord, the one who created humankind from a clot of blood. When Muhammad didn't know what had happened to him in that instance, when he couldn't interpret it, his wife Khadija brought him before one of her family members, a man named Waraka, a man that the sources say was learned in the scriptures. Waraka hears Muhammad's story, looks into his eyes, kisses him on the forehead, and says, verily, the prophet of your people has arrived. Who was Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the early 7th century in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka was a Christian, very likely a Catholic monk, who recognizes the prophet of a new religion, the coming of this different holy civilization in his midst. The sources suggest that Waraka never converts to Islam. The prophet never asks him, only recognizes that God is moving in new ways in his place and time. Part of an Islamic theology of interfaith cooperation. The third thing that Paul Knitter recognizes that is especially appropriate, I think, for Catholic universities is what the Catholic Church calls the dialogue of life. People like us from different religious backgrounds gathering in a room together under the auspices of a university named after the great church leader of faith and reason, St. Thomas Aquinas. Do we have a mic issue? Thank you for suggesting that. What does it mean to be involved in the dialogue of life? To have friendships with people from different religious backgrounds, to play in athletic teams with them, to be lab partners with them, to be in a math study group with them. What better place than a Catholic university to create the context for a dialogue of life? A place where people can interact with each other all the time in ways that promote cooperation. Why are Catholic universities precisely the place to be laboratories and launching pads for interfaith cooperation? Because it's at these universities where you can have courses that teach appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions. It's at these universities that your theology courses, which are required at a place like University of St. Thomas, can include theologies of interfaith cooperation. It's precisely in a context like this that people who orient around religion differently bump into each other all the time, form friendships, live out what the church calls that dialogue of life. So why is this so important? Why ought a Catholic university make this a priority? There's no shortage of things to prioritize in this day and age, right? Why make interfaith excellence a priority? I want to give you 3 reasons. Number 1, because our country and our world need it. America, according to some scholars, is the most religiously diverse nation in human history. That's stunning. Think about that. It means that more people from more different religious backgrounds have gathered in this political entity than in any political entity in the course of human history. And they bump into each other all the time. And religion matters in this country. Robert Putnam and David Campbell in American Grace pointed out that we're that remarkable nation that is both religiously diverse and religiously devout, and where positive interfaith cooperation has tended to be the civic norm, but it's not inevitable. We need to keep working at it. The fact of the matter is, faith identity can very easily be a bubble of isolation, a barrier of division, a bludgeon of domination, or a bridge of cooperation. None of those things are inevitable, right? Bridges don't rise from the ground or fall from the sky. People build them. Why should a Catholic university take interfaith cooperation seriously? Precisely because this is a perfect context to experiment with interfaith bridges and to nurture a critical mass of young people who identify themselves as interfaith bridge builders. Just like previous generations, current generations, in fact, call themselves human rights activists, civil rights leaders, environmentalists, social entrepreneurs. Part of the role of a Catholic university can be nurturing a generation of young people who proudly own the moniker, the identity category, interfaith leader. They learn the appreciative knowledge of other traditions here. They acquire a theology of interfaith cooperation here. They're engaged in the dialogue of life here. In other words, they do exactly what they ought to be doing at a university. They practice for the public. And then you put them out in the world, in the Twin Cities, in the broader state of Minnesota, and the Midwest, across the country and the world, and they're able to build those interfaith bridges wherever they go because of the knowledge and experiences they've gotten here. Then our social need for interfaith bridges is as high, I think, as it's ever been. Number 2, because a huge part of what universities do is set the standard for what it means to be an educated person and educate people to that standard. One of my favorite illustrations of this is the ability to read the New York Times from cover to cover and have a reasonable degree of context for those news stories. So I haven't actually looked at the New York Times today, but my wager is that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the paper has to do with religious identity and diversity. And if you don't have an understanding of who Sunni or Shia Muslims are, or which one is concentrated in Saudi Arabia and which one is concentrated in Iran, what the implications of the BJP in power in New Delhi is, what it means to be a Rohingya Muslim in an increasingly free Burma. You just don't have context with which to understand what's happening in our country, in our world. Part of the role of a university is to state what it means to be an educated person, to articulate that standard, and when you hand your diploma to people who are 22 or 42, you have a reasonable degree of confidence that that person, because of the years they have spent as an undergraduate at the University of St. Thomas, or in the law school or in the business school, has achieved that standard. How can you call yourself an educated person in early 21st century America without having some context for the religious diversity issues which rage across the world. The third reason I think that this ought to be a high priority at especially a Catholic university is because being a professional in our world requires interfaith vision, knowledge, and skills. Imagine being a doctor or a nurse in a hospital or a healthcare facility anywhere 20 square miles from here. Think about the various religious traditions of the patients you will treat on any given day. What do you do if, as in the case of the remarkable book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, a family brings in a little girl who's convulsing uncontrollably, and you, in your training as a Western doctor or nurse, diagnoses it as a seizure, and the family is Hmong from the mountains of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and they say, yes, that may be true, and also it is preparation for shamanhood. How do you engage that family in the tragic story in The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down? The 40 medical professionals that treated little Leah Lee in Merced, California, zero idea about the religious nature of the Hmong community. Zero idea that the drugs they were prescribing Leah Lee, which they were doing entirely out of their exceptional Western training, were viewed by the family as something that would block the return of Leah's soul, so they were not administered to Leah. Viewed the family as neglectful, had no idea that the family had traveled all over the country so that Leah could meet with senior Hmong shamans, had sent back to Laos and Cambodia for rare herbs from those mountains and put them around Leah's neck, had slaughtered many animals in the courtyard of their apartment complex so those animals' souls could be traded for Leah's soul in the other world. As a Western-trained doctor, does that mean you give up your training, your diagnosis? Does that mean you have to believe that Leah Lee is being prepared for shamanhood by her convulsions? Not entirely. But it would seem to me that it's a good thing for you to be able to communicate with that family, to know where they are coming from, to be able to talk to them about what the drugs might do, to engage in a conversation with leaders of that community about how the Hmong may treat this condition in one way, but how might they welcome Western treatment as well? By the way, this isn't, frankly, a remarkable situation. This happens in some way, shape, or form 6 times a day on Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, where the healthcare centers are located. If you're going to be a healthcare professional in the Twin Cities or Merced, California, or frankly, Buffalo or Chicago or San Antonio or Miami or anywhere, you're going to have to know something about the religious identities of the patients that you treat. For me, the single most tragic thing about Leah Lee's story is that a hospital administrator, when doing intake of the Lee family, marked under the category religious affiliation, none, had 0 radar screen for the spiritual worldview that the Lee family was bringing in to the hospital that day. How can you be an effective healthcare provider without some semblance of knowledge of that, without the ability, the lexicon, the radar screen to at least ask the question? I stayed in Midtown Minneapolis last night. I think I saw more Somali Muslims yesterday afternoon than I've seen coast to coast in this country, and I travel a lot. If you are going into business in the Twin Cities, and let's say that you become the 4-person, 4-man or 4-woman at a meat packing plant, and the Somali Muslims say, here's the times that we pray, and 3 of them, Zuhr, Asr, and Maghrib, let's just say, they conflict with when the plant operates. And the Somali Muslims say, we need 8 minutes to make our prayer and we'd really like to have the ritual washing facilities available to us. And a third of your workforce is Somali Muslim. And a factory can't operate when a third of its workforce goes off and prays. How do you engage that situation? This has happened in Greeley, Colorado. It's happened in Tennessee. It's happened in Iowa. It's happened in Wisconsin. Massive controversy every time. Wouldn't it be great if in your business school case studies, you were actually thinking ahead to this situation? And you might think to yourself, well, why should we make special accommodations for the Somali Muslims? And one of them who was familiar with America's civic ways might point out that it's really interesting that everybody gets December 25th off in America. That actually doesn't happen back in Somalia. And so the accommodations for your tradition happen to be built into your calendar. Back in Somalia, prayer times are accommodated by everybody. How do you deal with that kind of situation? Some version of that, whether it's with Somali Muslims or with Native Americans or with Orthodox Jews, is going to happen to you if you are in business, if you're in healthcare, if you're in law. Interfaith skills, knowledge, these are not just abstract matters that allow you to read the New York Times well, although I think that that's very important. They're also extremely present civic and professional matters. These are the kinds of things that are going to count all the time in a range of professions. Catholic colleges and universities, I think, as I said earlier, are an ideal place to attain interfaith excellence precisely because it is part of your DNA to offer theology courses, to teach an appreciative knowledge of other religious traditions, to encourage the dialogue of life that happens here on a continual basis. And that's how you serve here as a laboratory and a launching pad for professional excellence, for civic engagement, for the definition of being an educated person out there as well. It is in a way historically anomalous for me to be standing up here exhorting you to be even better at something you're already very good at. I mean, after all, the University of St. Thomas has, count them, 2 centers that engage with interfaith cooperation, the Center for Muslim-Christian Dialogue and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Engagement, right? There's very few places in the country that can boast those 2 things. Why am I exhorting you to be even better? And why is it anomalous for me to be up here in this situation? Well, it has not always been the case that Catholics have been making decisions about how and whether to welcome others. Frankly, for much of American history, the shoe was on the other foot. It was other people in positions of power and influence making decisions, asking the question, how should we welcome those seditious Catholics? Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, once said that the deepest bias in the American people is anti-Catholicism. Now, I'm not sure if that's totally true. There's a range of groups in America that have a reasonable, legitimate right to said crown. But for a historian of Schlesinger's caliber to say it's Catholics that have been on the business end of the boot of American prejudice for much of our history, well, that's something. In the colonial period, Pope Day events were common. The burning of the Pope in effigy. George Washington actually had to write a letter to his leaders in the Revolutionary Army to say, you have to ban these things because Catholics from Maryland are a part of our war against the British Empire. It's remarkable to think that we stand at a time in which Catholics get to make decisions about how to welcome others. I couldn't help but reflect on this as I was on the south lawn of the White House, 6-8 months ago in the fall of 2015. I thought to myself, all of those Kennedy-era fears have come to pass. In 1959 and 1960, people like Norman Vincent Peale and even Billy Graham, who I think in other instances was a great American religious leader, not in this one, were warning about the election of John F. Kennedy as president. They said that if you elect John F. Kennedy president, the Pope will arrive in Washington, D.C., and the flag of the Vatican will fly at the White House. And in October of 2015, as I was standing on the South Lawn waving the flag of the Vatican, as the Pope arrived in Washington, D.C., I thought to myself, well, this isn't so bad, is it? But think about this. All of 60 years ago, it was other people asking the question, well, just how many Catholics should we allow into our universities? And just how many Catholics should sit on the Supreme Court? And just how many Catholics should be in the Senate? And really, if we have more of them, aren't we aligning ourselves a little bit too closely with that Catholic dictator in Italy, that Catholic dictator in Spain? And isn't the Catholic Church inherently undemocratic? And won't it chafe against our ways in America? Well, I would say, as I mentioned at the top of this talk, Father Larry's organization before he came here to St. Thomas, that $4.6 billion organization that serves America, those 235 Catholic colleges and universities that serve America, those 600 some Catholic hospitals that serve America, the 7,000 Catholic grade school and high schools that serve America. Well, I would say the welcoming of the Catholic contribution to this country is one of the most significant things we have done in building our society in the past 50, 60, 100 years. It's not always the case. Kennedy got elected in 1960, as you all know, but a man named Al Smith, running in 1928, went down in an ugly flame of anti-Catholicism. It was at that time that a set of Protestant ministers stood up, created an organization called the NCCJ, the National Conference for Christians and Jews, and said, listen, the KKK is not going to win the day in this country. The Know-Nothing Party from 50 years back, that ethic is not going to win the day in this country. We're going to stand up and welcome the Catholic contribution here. It's interesting now. You guys are in that position. The newcomers speak different languages, pray to God in different ways, just like the folks who'd been here a little bit longer looked at you and said, boy, those strange German Catholic folk, those strange Italians, those strange Irish. One of the things that I've learned about this campus, just being here a little while, is the founder here imagined a college that would welcome waves of newcomers. Who are the newcomers? What does it mean to have an appreciative knowledge of their religious tradition? What does it mean to advance a theology of interfaith cooperation, a notion that engagement with them is holy, that the creation of them into us is a sacred trust? We hold that now at the University of St. Thomas. We make it manifest with this thing called the dialogue of life, inviting them here, encouraging the interaction and the encounters in this beautiful space. It's very interesting to be the community in a position of power, the welcomers instead of the ones who seek welcome. I think that that's also a sacred trust. In Islam, there's this beautiful notion that we were created to be the Abd and Khalifa of God, his servant and representative on the earth, right? We steward God's creation in alignment with God's vision. We do that when we are the less powerful ones. We have a different kind of responsibility, I think, when we are the more powerful ones. I want to close with this image. It is impossible to overstate my debt to the Catholic tradition. It really is. I'm in this country because the University of Notre Dame let in a wayward Muslim business school applicant from India back in the 1970s. That man would be my father. Went to the University of Notre Dame, the land of gray snow and white Catholics, said that he shook the hands of two great men when he was on that campus. One was Joe Montana, who led the Irish as the third string quarterback, mind you, to the 1977 national championship, and Father Ted Hesburgh, who cracked that, what was once a little known football school in South Bend, Indiana, into a major research university, invited Jews to serve on the board, recruited Muslims to be part of their programs. When I asked Father Hesburgh why he did all of this, he pounded his fist on the table, offered an expletive or two for expressionistic purposes, and said, "It's because the Bible calls us to be peacemakers, and because Catholic means universal." And I thought to myself, if this man hadn't pioneered 30, 40, 50 years ago, I literally wouldn't be here. Notre Dame would not have been a place that welcomed Muslim applicants from India. As I was in the security line to enter to see Pope Francis in October of 2015, the woman ahead of me in line, she was kind of pulled to the side because she had a bunch of, I guess, suspicious things in her backpack. And amongst those suspicious things was this massive bag of prayer beads. And the security guard was trying to figure out what was in this bag. And I pulled out my Muslim prayer beads, and I held them up, and I said, "They're prayer beads." And he looked at me and said, "Okay." And the woman looked at me and said, "Thank you." And I thought to myself, because I carry these prayer beads with me everywhere, and I know what it means to bring your prayer beads to your house of worship, to have a religious leader be in the presence of your prayer beads. I have this little vision of this woman back in her parish collecting prayer beads from all the congregants at this, little parish and wherever, Baltimore or Nashville or wherever. And all these people saying, we can't make the pilgrimage to see the Holy Father, but we want our prayer beads to be in his presence. And I thought to myself, something that I cherish as a Muslim. I want my prayer beads to be in the presence of the Aga Khan. I want my prayer beads to be in the presence of Sheikh Hamza Youssef. I know what it feels like to want your prayer beads to be in the presence of the Holy Father. The dialogue of life, an appreciative knowledge of another tradition, a sense of theology of interfaith cooperation in my own, a nation that's stronger, a Muslim community and a Catholic community living out what it is meant to live out. That's what this is all about. Thank you. I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Yes. If people could introduce themselves also, that'd be great. Name and how you might be affiliated with the university. I do know what you're talking about. Yes, sure. I thank you for that, by the way. I kind of feel like I'm the guy where people are shouting song requests to, So it's actually a profound moment. I don't tell that story very often anymore, but it played a very important role in my formation. It's actually in my book Sacred Ground. It's one of the stories at the end of the book. So I'm in this conference in Sydney, Australia, and it's an interfaith dialogue event, right? And what they've actually done is set up what I like to call the interfaith cage match. And I hate that, right? You find what you think are the fieriest religious leaders from any religious community, and you come up with the most controversial topic, and you basically set them at each other, right? and you think the audience is going to come and scream and yell, and I just think it's terrible. So I was enormously disappointed when this is what had happened. And it was, I believe, a Catholic and a Muslim. And I mean, the Muslim guy, I mean, he looked like he'd walked out of a 12th century cave, right? Like he had like a white tunic on and a like regulation sized beard, and he carried a staff. He just had this like kind of grim expression on his face. And I was thinking to myself, like, your people are not going to outscare our people. I promise you. Like, we got dudes like that, you know? So the Catholic guy starts, and he's from Pakistan, and he tells this terrible story of how his family had been, you know, hated and hounded and harassed in Pakistan, and their church had been burned down, and their family had been threatened, and all of this, I imagine, had happened, and it's terrible, right? And he goes on and on about how the Muslims of Pakistan did this, and nobody defended them, and then he ends by saying, the only thing I am grateful for is they did not truly live out the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, because if they had, then we surely would have perished, right? Which is, you know, the notion of the prophetic legacy is even more violent than these Cretan Muslims in Pakistan. So I am like a calm dude, right? Like I do calmness for a living. I like to say that I'm a Muslim that doesn't scare white people, you know? Like I play the Muslim Mr. Rogers on TV, but I am getting like hot. I'm getting like sweaty. Like I'm like, let me into the cage. And like, I am glad that the dude with the staff is my man, right? Because I'm like, let this guy have it. And my man looks at him and says, I am only sorry that I was not present, because I would have defended you in honor of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him. And he goes on to talk about his admiration for Christianity and the Catholic tradition and the Muslim tradition of mercy, and how it would call a Muslim who was following the prophetic model to protect a Catholic family in Pakistan who was under siege. And he does it so gently and with such like love, you know, and I could almost see the television cameras get disappointed, you know, like where's the yelling and screaming? But it was stunning, right? It was stunningly beautiful. And honestly, I think that is like a level of holiness that, I mean, in my best moments, I might get 5 light years away from, right? But it was instructive to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, don't set up the interfaith cage match, right? Don't like find the most fiery person from 5 different religions and have them talk about the most controversial topic on the planet. There are ways to generate an audience, to create energy that is not about controversy, right? And it's interesting to me how easy it is to instinct to that. It's ready, it's there, it's kind of our default position. And the second is I got, you know, an example of what grace looks like, right? Of what mercy looks like. Like mercy is not responding to kindness with kindness. Mercy is responding to anger with kindness. It's the ability to step back and express love for a tradition and a person who's not expressing love for you as a person or for the tradition you come from. So it was a moment that taught me an awful lot about Islam as well. You know, the Quran says frequently that the Prophet Muhammad is nothing but a reminder, right? A reminder of the message that Isa, that Jesus, that Moses, that Abraham, that Adam brought, right? So for me, this guy in Australia was a reminder of the mercy and gentleness and grace that I think is at the level of what's called ihsan, or excellence in Islam. So I appreciate you knowing that story and reminding me about it. I'm impressed with myself that I remembered it, actually. Other questions or comments? Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm honestly, uh, I am, I am an optimist by nature, but I think also, frankly, because I'm an American and I'm a Muslim, right? And I think both of those traditions, I think gratitude and optimism are at the center of those traditions. And a time when I was actually not optimistic, I was like shoved back into place by one of the spiritual leaders I admire the most, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. This was around the Ground Zero Mosque madness, and it was, Sheikh Hamza called to give me Eid greetings, and he asked me how I was doing, and I was like, I'm doing terribly. I opened Sacred Ground with this story. I'm like, look at how people are treating what is meant to be a Muslim YMCA, right? Started by a Sufi imam. There are actually wrathful people in the world. Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf is not one of them, right? And Sheikh Hamza was like, you shouldn't be depressed or sorry or angry. You should be thrilled, right? This is when the better angels of America come out, right? I mean, how do you expect to build a movement for pluralism unless the faces of prejudice reveal themselves? And it was really striking for me, right? There's the surah that I love the most in the Holy Quran is Surah 93, which is a couple of years into the Prophet's mission. Revelation pauses. He thinks that it has stopped and that God has forsaken him. And then, one day, this new revelation comes bursting into his consciousness, which basically says, by the evening hours and by the light of day, God has neither forsaken you nor left you for nothing. Did I not find you an orphan and lead you? Did I not find you who's missed his way and guided you, right? So do not oppress the orphan and do not marginalize the widow, and constantly recount the favors of your Lord. I love that, right? Because there's this sense of like, did you think that I left you? Number one. And number two, you have a responsibility to the world that frankly does not allow you to be depressed, right? You have a responsibility to the world that requires your energy. And by the way, that energy comes from me. So don't forget to thank me along the way. But I love that, right? I mean, I find that so powerful. And the other thing that I think about is honestly, between the time of the Peel Conference in September, October 1960, right? I mean, this is a conference of the 200 most influential Protestant leaders of the time. Billy Graham is behind it, right? So this is a massively influential conference saying that if John F. Kennedy is elected, that literally the Roman Catholic, Romanism is what they called it, would permeate the land and America would cease to exist the way that we know it. Our freedom, our very religious freedom is at stake. This is in October 1960. And 55 years later, Pope Francis is welcomed as, I mean, like literally, people would have been like, why don't you take up residence in the White House, That is not a long time, right? In that time, 6 of 9 seats in the Supreme Court are Catholic seats. The vice president is Catholic. The secretary of state is Catholic. I mean, how many, members in 2012 who ran in the Republican primary race were Catholic? Newt Gingrich converts from evangelical Protestantism to Catholicism. Every time he gets a new wife, he converts, by the way. It's an interesting pattern. But he converts to Catholicism, and he garners the votes of the same people who in 1960 were saying that Romanism was going to permeate the land if somebody who was not especially Catholic, Mr. John F. Kennedy, right, not particularly devout, let us say, was elected. That's not a long period of time, right? So America changes, and I think the question is, are you willing to do the work? Right? And look, at the end of the day, I mean, I have the best job in the world. I get to work with college professors who are, I think, optimistic by nature. I mean, they like to grumble sometimes, but generally they're optimistic by nature. 19-year-olds who are like, let's go, 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 go. College campuses that both want to stay true to their founding visions, which are generally extremely inspiring and want to be in the vanguard. So, I mean, I get to work with the folks who are building the next world consistent with what I think matters. So what's there not to be optimistic about? I do get mad sometimes. I will say that. Many occasions to get mad recently. Yes.
So I'm Bob Osborne with Wilberforce Academy, and I've been in campus ministry at the secular University of University of Minnesota, which we call the U around here. So my question is a different one, coming from that context. In your work, how are you engaging secular worldviews? And I'm talking about naturalistic, materialist worldviews.
Yeah.
And are representatives of those worldviews willing to acknowledge that they don't have any sort of epistemic superiority over the rest of
Yes.
traditional religious worldviews?
Yeah.
So I want to see how, if they're willing to play ball on the same field you're playing.
So, it's a great question. The table or field that we set up, we would like it to welcome. In fact, it does welcome, and our kind of demographics illustrates that, people who we say orient around religion differently, which is everything from Catholics to traditionalist Muslims to Orthodox Jews to naturalists, humanists, atheists, agnostics, and no, they're not willing to give up their epistemic superiority, and nor do the Catholics that I know, or the Muslims or the Jews. And part of the way we set up the field is you don't have to. Of course you believe you have the feast. If you didn't, why wouldn't you convert to something else, right? The whole point is we are trying to build a country where people believe they have the feast, right? And and yet those belief systems acknowledge beauty, truth, value in other traditions. Our nation requires us all to work together. The voices of dogmatists and barrier builders and bludgeon wielders from all traditions are the most dangerous voices that we have. So I don't think the issue is to kind of turn down the volume on one's epistemic truth. I think the issue is, how does one build relationships with people when they disagree with their doctrine and when they believe their own doctrine. So I'll close with this notion and have Father Larry have the last word here. But a friend of mine, Scott Alexander, runs the Catholic Muslim Studies program at Catholic Theological Union. And that institution reports up to the Archbishop or the Cardinal of Chicago in some way, shape, or form. I'm learning that every institution in the Catholic tradition somehow reports somewhere. So Scott will have an annual or every other year meeting with whoever the Archbishop or the Cardinal is. And back when he started, it was Cardinal George. And the Cardinal, it was an hour-long meeting, and the Cardinal would always begin the meeting by saying, "Scott, you do know that it is a legitimate and significant endeavor of the Catholic Church to seek to convert Muslims to the fullness of truth." And Scott would say, "Yes, I know that." And the next 59 minutes and 30 seconds was spent on the various interfaith bridge building programs and conferences and classes that Scott was leading. I love that, right? I mean, the Cardinal was doing exactly what you would expect a Cardinal to do, which is he was saying, let's mark that we who are Catholic, especially in this little building called the Archdiocese, right, that we believe we have the fullness of truth, and that we believe it is an act of generosity to respectfully invite people into that. Like, welcome to thinking you have the feast. And we think it is holy to build positive relationships, to develop appreciative understanding, to facilitate a dialogue of life with people who believe differently than we do. Both the Great Commission and the Great Cooperation. I mean, I think that's the Holy Grail that we are seeking. Thank you so much, everyone.
Eboo, thank you for your time on our campus, and especially for your words right now, which certainly will give us inspiration as we continue to go down that path of interfaith cooperation. Especially thank you for all that you're doing in our country and around the world to really create a society that is a society of understanding and tolerance. So again, our thanks for being here.